Welcome to Fireside History. Today we tell you the story of an impossible retreat. Imagine marching through frozen mountains, believing you will return home for Christmas. Suddenly, 15,000 Marines like you find themselves trapped. They are surrounded by 120,000 enemy soldiers hidden in the snow. The temperature plummets to 37 degrees below zero. The offensive has turned into a desperate fight for survival. Let's begin with today's story. To understand how they reached that frozen hell, we must go back just a few months. Imagine the summer of 1950, a somber moment for United Nations forces in Korea. Their troops, along with those of South Korea, were cornered. They had their backs to the sea, trapped in a small pocket of resistance known as the Pusan perimeter. Each day, the defensive line shrank a little more under North Korean pressure. Total defeat was not a possibility. It seemed a certainty. It was at this point of utter desperation when General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander, put a plan on the table. It was an idea so radical that his own staff called it suicidal. The proposal was audacious, a massive amphibious landing hundreds of kilometers behind enemy lines in the port of Incheon. The risks were almost absurd. Incheon experienced the second most extreme tides on the planet, with differences of almost 9 meters between high and low tide. This meant that landing craft would only have a window of a few hours to act. If they failed, they would be stranded on immense mudflats like easy targets. And if that weren't enough, the city had no beaches. It was protected by high seawalls that the Marines would have to scale with ladders under enemy fire. Despite the warnings, MacArthur insisted. On September 15, 1950, the operation was launched. The surprise was total. The North Korean High Command, obsessed with crushing Pusan, never imagined such a deep strike into their rear. The Marines scaled the walls and secured the port with a speed that defied all logic. The operation, considered almost impossible, was a resounding success. The effect was devastating for the North Korean army. Overnight, their supply lines were cut. Between the hammer of Incheon and the anvil of Pusan, their army disintegrated. Tens of thousands of soldiers surrendered or fled. The capital, Seoul, was liberated in less than 2 weeks. The victory was so spectacular that it generated a dangerous sense of euphoria and invincibility in the Allied command. MacArthur was acclaimed as an infallible military genius. No one suspected that this brilliant triumph was, in reality, the prologue to a catastrophe. The euphoria, after the overwhelming success in Incheon, was total. At General MacArthur's headquarters, the war was considered practically won. Victory seemed so close that a decision was made that would change the course of the conflict forever. United Nations forces were ordered to cross the 38th parallel. The objective was no longer simply to restore the original border. Now it was about unifying the entire Korean peninsula by force. The plan was to push the North Koreans all the way to the border with China, the Yalu River. Meanwhile, increasingly serious warnings were coming from Beijing. China publicly declared that it would not stand idly by if a hostile force approached its border. But these threats were dismissed at headquarters as mere propaganda. They were considered the bluff of a country that would not dare to challenge the United States. The arrogance was such that not even the capture of the first Chinese soldiers on Korean soil raised alarms. They were considered isolated volunteers, not the vanguard of a massive army that was secretly gathering. How was such blindness possible? To make matters worse, MacArthur divided his forces in a very risky manner. The 8th Army would advance along the west coast, while the 10th Corps, which included the 1st Marine Division, would do so in the east. Between both armies stretched a huge gap of almost 80 kilometers. It was mountainous and impassable terrain that left them completely isolated. They were unable to support each other if something went wrong. With morale sky high, the Marines began their advance north. They ventured into the frozen mountains of Korea, convinced they were taking the last steps of the war. The promise of being home by Christmas resonated in all conversations. They could not imagine that, with every kilometer they traveled, they were venturing further and further into a perfectly designed trap. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers had already secretly crossed the Yalu River, and now they were waiting for them, patiently hidden in the snow. While euphoria reigned in the United Nations camp, thousands of kilometers away, in Beijing, the atmosphere was very different. For Chinese leader Mao Zedong, the situation was unacceptable. A Western army at the gates of his country, on the Yalu River, represented an existential threat to his young communist government. The decision he made was monumental. He would not openly declare war. Instead, he would send a massive force under the clever name of the People's Volunteer Army. Officially, China was not at war. Unofficially, it was about to unleash hell. The force designated to confront the 10th Corps in the east was the 9th Army Group. It was commanded by General Song Shilun, a veteran hardened by decades of civil war. His army was comprised of 3 full corps, numbers 20, 26, and 27. In early November 1950, this force of approximately 120,000 men began to cross the Yalu River in secret. How is it possible to move such a large army undetected? The answer lies in an almost superhuman iron discipline. Imagine these soldiers. They marched exclusively at night, in glacial cold and absolute silence. They moved along the steepest mountain paths, far from the main roads. At the first ray of dawn, the order was to disappear. Every man, every horse, and every piece of artillery had to be perfectly camouflaged. They hid in forests, ravines, or under white blankets that blended with the snow. They were ordered not to move or light fires during the day, regardless of the cold. For weeks, American reconnaissance planes flew over the area without seeing absolutely anything. Below, invisible to their eyes, a ghost army slipped through the landscape. It was methodically positioning itself to encircle the Marines, who advanced without suspecting the magnitude of the trap looming over them. Leading the 1st Marine Division was Major General Oliver P. Smith. Unlike many in the High Command, Smith was a cautious and methodical man. He did not share the general euphoria. As his men advanced, he felt a growing unease observing the terrain. They were entering the Taebaek Mountains, a desolate and brutal region in the heart of North Korea. Their objective was the Chosin Reservoir, an artificial lake surrounded by icy peaks and deep valleys. It was not a place for a modern army. To get there, the Marines depended on a single precarious dirt road. They called it the main supply route. It was a 125-kilometer serpent that twisted through gorges and skirted cliffs. In most of its sections, it was so narrow that only one vehicle could pass at a time. This fragile line was their only connection to the outside world. It was their only way to receive reinforcements, ammunition, food, and evacuate the wounded. What would happen if that route was cut? The answer was as simple as it was terrifying. They would be trapped. And then the other enemy arrived. One that did not hide in the shadows, but enveloped everything. A Siberian front descended upon the mountains, bringing with it one of the harshest winters ever recorded in the region. Temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero and kept falling. The wind cut like razor blades. The metal of weapons burned the skin upon contact. The ground froze solid as steel, making it impossible to dig trenches. By late November, Smith's division was dangerously extended. His regiments were dispersed along the route in small outposts like Kotori, Hagaru-ri, and Yudamni. They were isolated from each other, connected only by that icy thread of road. The trap, prepared with such patience by General Song Shilun, was ready. The Marines were exactly where he wanted them. Frozen, divided, and completely vulnerable. All that was left was to give the signal. On the night of November 27th, 1950, the trap closed. Imagine the silence. A dense and absolute silence, broken only by the crunch of snow under boots and the whistle of a wind that freezes to the soul. The Marines, huddled in their makeshift shelters around Udamni, try to endure the cold. They haven't seen the enemy for days. Perhaps the warnings were exaggerated. Suddenly, a strange sound breaks the calm. It's not the roar of artillery. They are bugles. Bugles playing sharp, dissonant calls that echo through the frozen valleys. Accompanied by the piercing sound of whistles, they create a ghostly cacophony in the darkness. For the Marines, it's something incomprehensible. What kind of army announces its attack? But it wasn't an announcement. It was an order. From the snow itself, thousands of figures dressed in white rose like specters. They were the Chinese infantry. They had crawled for hours, stealthily approaching the American lines, until they were only meters away. The bugles were not for intimidation. They were their communication system, directing massive and coordinated assaults in the darkness. The attack was simultaneous and brutal. Waves of soldiers launched against the positions of the 5th and 7th Marine Regiments. They weren't seeking a battle of attrition. Their objective was to infiltrate, sow chaos, and disintegrate the defenses from within. Along the winding road, other Chinese detachments attacked key points, cutting off the route in multiple places. The combat turned into a desperate melee in total darkness. The Marines fought hand to hand, often without knowing where the enemy or their comrade was. Weapons froze, grenades sometimes did not explode. With the first light of dawn, the terrible truth became evident. They were no longer an invasion force. The road, their only escape route, was blocked. They were completely surrounded. The fight for the unification of Korea was over. Now the fight for survival began. The Chinese ambush was only the beginning of hell. The Marines soon discovered they were not fighting one enemy, but two. The second was silent, omnipresent, and much older. It was the Korean winter itself, which had decided to unleash all its fury. Imagine a temperature that drops to 37 degrees below zero. To this, add a relentless wind that pierces through every layer of clothing. A wind that makes the wind chill even lower. It's not a cold that makes you shiver. It's a cold that slowly steals your life, that freezes your will. The simple act of breathing became an ordeal. The icy air burned the lungs. Sweat from combat froze instantly. It created a layer of ice stuck to the skin beneath the uniform. Frostbite became the main cause of casualties. It was an invisible enemy that mutilated men as they stood guard. Approximately 9,000 American soldiers would suffer its effects. In this environment, technological superiority vanished. Weapons became useless chunks of metal. The Mungaran rifles, semi-automatic and reliable, froze after each shot. Soldiers had to operate them manually, as if they were old bolt-action rifles. Machine guns, which required a constant flow of oil, jammed. The lubricant turned into a dense, sticky paste. The cold attacked everything. Radio batteries lost their charge in minutes. This left units isolated, without communication in the midst of chaos. The bare metal of a trigger or bolt would stick to the skin. If a soldier touched it without gloves, it would tear off his skin when he pulled away. For the medics, it was a lost battle. How to treat a wounded person in these conditions? Morphine syringes were frozen. They were solid blocks. Doctors had to put them in their own mouths or under their armpits to thaw them. Meanwhile, the wounded person waited, agonizing. Blood plasma, stored in glass bottles, froze and shattered. It turned into useless fragments. Even food rebelled. Cans of combat rations were bricks of ice. The men had to warm them over small fires. But making a fire was inviting an enemy sniper. Many simply sucked on the frozen contents, trying to extract some calories. This was not a conventional war. It was a struggle for survival against an army and against the planet. The men at Chosin not only faced death by a bullet, they faced dying from freezing, often alone in the darkness. The cold was the enemy that never slept. Amidst absolute chaos, a small frozen village became the epicenter of survival. It was called Hagaruri and was located at the southern end of the reservoir. It was much more than a simple village. It was the nerve center of the division. There was the main supply depot and the makeshift hospital. If Hagaruri fell, everything would collapse. General Smith knew it. For this reason, its defense became the top priority. Chinese attacks were constant and fierce, day and night. They sought to break the thin perimeter protecting the village. The fight for Hagaruri was a total effort. Marines and army soldiers fought side by side. Engineers, cooks, and clerks also took up a rifle. Everyone defended the thin line that separated them from annihilation. While the battle raged on the perimeter, an engineering miracle was taking place in the center of the village. A battalion of engineers worked tirelessly under enemy fire. Their mission was to build an airfield. Imagine the task. They had to flatten frozen ground as hard as concrete. They did it with heavy machinery, while bullets and mortars whistled around them. It was a race against time and against death. The objective was to create a runway long and stable enough for C-47 transport planes. These planes were the only hope for evacuating the thousands of wounded accumulating in the hospital. Against all odds, they succeeded. The 900-meter runway was finished just in time. It was not just a construction project. It was becoming the only exit gate from that hell. Thanks to it, over 4,000 seriously wounded were evacuated by air. Men who otherwise were doomed to die frozen in the snow. For the thousands of Marines fighting for their lives north of the reservoir, there was only one way back. One road, and in the middle of that road, a crucial mountain pass. Dokdong Pass. Controlling that point meant keeping the only escape route open. The task of defending this impossible position fell upon a single company, Fox Company of the 7th Marines. They were approximately 240 men, under the command of Captain William Barber. Their mission was simple and suicidal. They had to take a hill dominating the pass and not yield it under any circumstances. For 5 days and 5 nights, starting November 27, these men clung to that icy summit. History would remember it as Fox Hill. They did not face a battalion. They faced what is estimated to have been thousands of Chinese soldiers determined to annihilate them and close the pass. Imagine the nights, lit only by the glow of flares on the snow. Wave after wave of Chinese infantry ascended the slope. Bugles and whistles sounded, and the attack began anew. The Marines responded with everything they had, until ammunition almost ran out. The combat became primitive. They fought with bayonets, with the butts of their rifles, with fists and knives in the glacial darkness. Casualties were terrible. More than half the company fell, between dead and wounded. Captain Barber himself was severely wounded in the leg, but refused to be evacuated. Tied to a stretcher, he continued to direct the defense. There was a reason for such tenacity. Barber and his men knew they were not fighting only for their lives. While they resisted, the 5th and 7th Marine Regiments were forcing their way through from the north, trying to reach Hagaruri. Fox Company was holding the door open. If that hill fell, thousands of their comrades would have been annihilated without remedy. Their resistance was a legendary act that changed the fate of the battle. In Hagaruri, General Oliver P. Smith was analyzing a map that showed a tactical nightmare. His division was fragmented, surrounded, and outnumbered. From the outside, the only logical option seemed to be surrender or total annihilation. The pressure on his shoulders was unimaginable. But Smith was not a man who would succumb to panic. While chaos reigned around him, he maintained an almost legendary calm. In the midst of the crisis, a war correspondent managed to ask him the question everyone was thinking. Was the 1st Marine Division in full retreat? Smith's reply would become one of the most iconic moments in the history of the Marine Corps. He looked at him intently, and with a mixture of defiance and pragmatism, uttered the words that would change the morale of the entire division. Retreat? No way. We're not retreating. We're just attacking in a different direction. This phrase was not mere propaganda. It was a declaration of intent and a masterpiece of leadership. With a few words, Smith transformed a desperate situation into a mission with a clear purpose. They weren't fleeing. They were fighting their way out. The plan was as brutal as it was straightforward. The northernmost units at Udumne were to consolidate into a single armored column. They would become the spearhead. Their objective was to break through to the south, fighting for every meter of the frozen road. On their way, they would pick up the heroic survivors of Fox Company at Tokton Pass. Then, all forces would gather at the Hagaruri base for the next jump. From there, the entire division, carrying its wounded and equipment, would fight to reach Kotori. The final destination was the port of Hungnam. It was not a disorganized flight. It was a methodical offensive, a coordinated attack to the south. Every Marine, from private to officer, now had a new mission. It was no longer about surviving. It was about attacking. While the Marines on the ground fought for every meter of icy road, the battle had a third dimension, one that was waged in the skies of Cierre, between mountain peaks and blizzard clouds. For the pilots of the Air Force and Marine Aviation, the enemy was not just anti-aircraft fire. It was the weather itself, an adversary as lethal as the waves of Chinese infantry. From dawn to dusk, the Afaru Corsair fighters became the guardian angels of the men on the ground. Imagine seeing one of those planes dive through the snow. They released their payload of napalm and rockets onto concentrations of Chinese troops hidden on the slopes. For the Marines, the roar of their engines was the most comforting sound in the world. It was the artillery that they didn't have, the support that prevented their positions from being overrun again and again. But it wasn't just about attacking. Survival depended on a constant flow of supplies arriving by air. The enormous C-119 flying boxcar transport planes flew over the isolated positions. They opened their rear doors to parachute everything necessary: ammunition, rations, batteries for radios, and medical supplies. It was a rain of hope amidst the despair. However, the most crucial element of this airlift was medical evacuation. The C-47 Skytrain transport planes performed an incredible feat. They landed and took off non-stop on the improvised runway at Hagaruri, often under mortar fire. Each plane that took to the air carried dozens of seriously wounded men with it, men who would have frozen to death in a matter of hours. This air superiority was what prevented the retreat from becoming an annihilation. It provided the offensive muscle, vital logistics, and the only escape route for the most vulnerable. Without the brave pilots who defied the ice and enemy fire, Oliver Smith's famous quote about attacking in another direction would have remained a bitter irony. The Hagaruri airstrip was an icy scar on the landscape, a promise of salvation built with sweat, blood, and incredible determination. As soon as it was ready, one of the most desperate air evacuations in history began. Imagine the scene: an endless line of stretchers stretched across the snow. The wounded, tagged according to the severity of their injuries, waited in silence under the biting cold. Each man was a testament to the brutality of combat and winter. Some had bullet or shrapnel wounds. Others, their feet and hands blackened by frostbite. C-47 transport planes appeared in the sky like apparitions. They landed on the short, icy airstrip, often under Chinese mortar fire. There was no time for subtleties. Crews kept their engines running while medics and volunteers hastily loaded the wounded aboard. They seated them on the metal floor, shoulder to shoulder, or secured them in makeshift bunks. Inside the cabin, relief mingled with pain. For many of those men, the roar of the engines upon takeoff was the sweetest sound they had ever heard. It was the sound of a second chance. The pilots, for their part, were anonymous heroes who flew into danger again and again, knowing that each trip meant the difference between life and death for dozens of people. For several days, this airlift operated tirelessly. Planes that arrived loaded with ammunition and medical supplies left packed with wounded. When the last plane departed Hagaruri, the number was astonishing. A total of 4,312 men were evacuated by air. Each of those takeoffs was a victory, a life saved from the icy hell. But for the thousands of healthy men remaining on the ground, the escape hatch had closed. Their mission now was to fight their way through the mountains. The attack in a different direction had only just begun. With the wounded finally safe, the division transformed into a walking fortress. It prepared for the most dangerous stretch of its journey. 18 kilometers of icy road separated Hagaruri from the next outpost, Kotori. It was not a march. It was a corridor of death. Imagine the column in motion. Tanks opened the way, their treads crushing the snow, while others protected the rear. In the center, a long serpent of trucks transported ammunition and heavy equipment. On both sides of the vehicles, the Marines marched on foot. They were the column's human shield. Their eyes were fixed on the snowy peaks that flanked them. They knew death would come from there. And it came. Without warning, hell broke loose from the heights. The sound of Chinese machine guns rebounded in the valleys. Mortar fire fell on the road, seeking the trucks loaded with ammunition. The entire column stopped. The Marines threw themselves into the snow, returning fire. A patrol, sometimes an entire company, had to leave the road and assault the hill to silence the enemy. Imagine the cost of that advance. They cleared a position, collected their newly wounded, and the column set off again, only to be stopped a few hundred meters further on by another ambush. It was a brutal and exhausting cycle. Every meter of frozen asphalt was paid with time, ammunition, and lives. They advanced at a desperately slow pace, sometimes less than a kilometer per hour. The fight was constant, without respite, against an enemy who always had the advantage of elevated terrain. The 18 kilometers to Kotori became one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the entire retreat. The famous attack in another direction was, in reality, a test of human endurance pushed to the absolute limit. After the bloody march to Kotori, a glimmer of hope began to warm the spirits of the Marines. They were exhausted, decimated, but they had overcome every trap, every ambush. The port of Hungnam, and with its salvation, finally seemed to be within reach. Only one last major obstacle remained on the map, a winding stretch of road that descended through the mountains, through a place called Funchalin Pass. The column resumed its march, now on the final leg of its southward attack. But when the vanguard reached a critical point of the pass, it stopped, dead. The news that reached General Smith by radio was like a punch to the gut. Where there should have been a concrete bridge crossing a deep gorge, now there was only an abyss. The Chinese engineers had done an impeccable job. They had blown up the structure, leaving a gap several meters wide over a vertical drop of hundreds of meters. There was no way around it. On both sides of the gorge, the walls were cliffs of rock and ice. The road, their only escape route was broken. Imagine the scene. The enormous column of 10,000 men, tanks, and trucks stops. Silence spreads among the soldiers as the news travels by word of mouth. After surviving the human waves, the 37-degree below zero cold, the lack of ammunition, and hand-to-hand combat, after fighting for every meter of frozen ground for more than 100 kilometers, it had all been in vain. The enemy had not defeated them with bullets, but with a bit of dynamite. The feeling was one of absolute despair. They felt like caged animals. They were trapped on a dead-end mountain road, with the Chinese army preparing to deliver the coup de grace. It seemed that the attack in another direction had come to its tragic end. The desperation in Funchalen Pass was total. For the trapped men, that abyss seemed like the end of the road. But at headquarters, an incredibly bold idea began to take shape. If they couldn't build a bridge, perhaps the sky could deliver it to them. The plan was a logistical feat never before attempted. It consisted of airdropping the 8 enormous sections of an M2 treadway bridge. Each steel section weighed over a ton. On December the 7th, the Air Force's enormous C-119 flying boxcar planes appeared over the mountains. One by one, they opened their rear doors. Imagine the scene. Giant double parachutes opened in the frozen air. From them hung the heavy steel girders that slowly descended towards a small drop zone, surrounded by enemy positions. It was a miracle of precision. The pilots dropped their cargo with astonishing accuracy, preventing it from falling into Chinese hands or crashing against the cliffs. On the ground, Marine and Army engineers immediately set to work. It wasn't just a construction job. It was a battle against time, the cold, and enemy fire. With fingers numb from the extreme cold, they handled the frozen metal pieces. Enemy snipers fired from nearby ridges, turning every movement into a deadly risk. For 2 days and nights, they assembled that structure over the abyss. They guided the girders into position and joined them while snow fell around them. Finally, the bridge was complete, a steel scar that joined the 2 sides of the gorge. The path to the sea was open again. The column resumed its march. Tanks, trucks, and thousands of exhausted men began to cross, one by one. They left behind the place where a miracle fallen from the sky had saved them from the brink of annihilation. On December 13, 1950, the first elements of the column finally reached the safety of Hungnam's defensive perimeter. The long march was over. They had emerged from the icy hell. Imagine those men, covered in grime, with beards of ice, and the vacant stare of those who have seen too much. They walked like specters, leaning on each other, leaving behind a trail of 125 kilometers of steel, blood, and courage. They had achieved the impossible. An entire division had fought its way through an army that outnumbered it in one of the worst winters on record. It was a tactical success, a testament to resilience that would be studied for generations. But every victory has a price. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir lasted 17 days. When the final count was made, the figures were chilling. In the 1st Marine Division alone, there were approximately 4,400 combat casualties, including dead and wounded, men who fell to enemy bullets and shrapnel. But the most terrible statistic was another. More than 7,300 men were classified as non-combat casualties. The vast majority of them, victims of severe frostbite. The cold, that silent enemy, had wounded almost twice as many men as the Chinese army itself. For the infantry units that bore the brunt of the fighting, the casualty rate approached catastrophic levels. They had survived, yes, but they had left a part of themselves in those frozen mountains. They were not retreating. They had attacked in a different direction. And although they accomplished their mission, the cost of that attack would be measured for a long time in hospitals and in silent absences at home. Survival had been their only victory. But the story of Chosin doesn't end with the Marines reaching the sea. On the other side of the hills, in the silence that followed the battle, another tragedy unfolded, one of an almost unimaginable scale. Imagine for a moment not being a Marine, but one of the soldiers of the Chinese 9th Army Group. You have accomplished your mission. You have forced the enemy's retreat. But the price of that strategic victory is appalling. Your uniform is made of padded cotton, completely inadequate for the Siberian scourge. Your shoes are canvas and rubber, and your feet have been frozen for weeks. You have no sleeping bags. You sleep huddled with your comrades in the snow to share what little body heat you have left. Your logistics are almost non-existent. Rations are frozen potatoes that you must warm up as best you can, at the risk of giving away your position. Medical supplies are a luxury that doesn't exist. If you are wounded, or if frostbite takes hold of your limbs, your fate is practically sealed. Song Shilan's army achieved its objective, but was destroyed in the process. Exact figures are difficult to confirm, but historians' estimates speak of a catastrophe. It is estimated that they suffered over 40,000 combat casualties, an already terrible figure. But the most grim fact is another. It is believed that a similar number, perhaps even greater, were victims of the cold. Men who froze to death at their posts, or who suffered amputations so severe that they would never fight again. It was a Pyrrhic victory. The 9th Army Group, one of China's elite formations, was so decimated that it had to be withdrawn from the front. It would not be combat effective again for the next 3 months. In the frozen mountains of Chosin, perhaps there were no true victors. There were only survivors, marked forever by a common enemy that distinguished no uniforms: winter. Reaching the port of Hungnam was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of one of the largest maritime evacuations in military history. Imagine the scene at the port. There was no joy, only deep exhaustion and a frantic, organized activity. As the last soldiers emerged from the mountains, an enormous fleet of almost 200 ships waited in the icy waters. The mission now was to extract the entire U.S. 10th Corps from Korea. They were 105,000 soldiers with all their equipment. But it soon became clear that not only soldiers needed to be saved. A human tide of Korean refugees descended upon Hungnam. They were tens of thousands of civilians, entire families fleeing the communist advance, pleading for passage to freedom. Faced with this humanitarian crisis, a monumental decision was made. As many civilians as possible would be evacuated. What followed was an incredible exodus, often called the Christmas cargo. At the heart of this operation lies the story of the merchant vessel SS Meredith Victory, a ship designed to carry cargo and only 12 passengers. The crew, in an astonishing act of compassion, unloaded almost all its provisions and weapons to make space. They managed to embark more than 14,000 refugees in its holds. For 3 days, they sailed undefended and in extremely overcrowded conditions. Surprisingly, not a single person died on the journey. Between December 15 and 24, the operation continued tirelessly. A total of 91,000 civilians were brought to safety. Alongside them, 17,500 vehicles and 350,000 tons of supplies were evacuated. When the last ship sailed on Christmas Eve, demolition teams blew up the piers and port facilities. They left nothing useful for the enemy. The attack in another direction had ended, not with a surrender, but with a promise fulfilled. They had saved an army and a people. The Hungnam evacuation marked the end of the battle, but its echo was just beginning to resonate in history. Those 17 days of hell at the Chosin Reservoir not only saved a division, they completely changed the course of the war and the perception of power in the world. The hope of a quick victory, of being home by Christmas, vanished in the icy air of the Korean mountains. The audacious advance northward came to a screeching halt. The Chinese intervention proved decisive, transforming the conflict into a brutal and prolonged war of attrition. The fighting would return to the 38th parallel, where it would stall for almost 3 more years. For the world, the battle was a revelation. The young People's Republic of China, hitherto underestimated, had proven to be a formidable adversary. It had challenged the greatest military power on the planet and forced it to retreat. Its reputation as a force to be reckoned with on the world stage was cemented in the snows of Chosin. But the battle's deepest legacy was forged in the heart of the United States Marine Corps. For them, Chosin was never a retreat. It was their most defining moment. A test of endurance, courage, and brotherhood that became a foundational legend. The battle transformed into the ultimate example of esprit de corps, that spirit of camaraderie that unites the Marines. A story of tenacity that is told to every new recruit to teach them the meaning of never giving up, no matter the circumstances. The veterans who survived that odyssey received a title of honor. They are known as the Chosin Few. They are not just survivors. They are living symbols of the human capacity to endure the unbearable and prevail. Ultimately, the story of Chosin is not just one of a brilliant tactical maneuver. It is the story of how the will to survive against all odds can forge a legend that inspires generations. And thus concludes our journey to the icy hell of the Chosin Reservoir. Thank you very much for joining us until the end in this incredible story of survival. We hope you found this documentary revealing and instructive. Telling these stories is our passion. If you want us to continue bringing these important historical events to life, your support is essential. Please consider liking this video, as it helps us enormously to continue our work. And if you wish to join us on future journeys into the past, do not forget to subscribe to our channel. That way you won't miss any of our upcoming stories.